Hi everyone, welcome to our final event of our Beyond Measure Research and Evidence in Culture and Health series. My name's Erica Ramsey. I'm a project manager in the Cultural Institute at the University of Leeds, and I will talk more about Beyond Measure shortly, but first of all I'll do the all-important housekeeping. So first of all, for attendees today, your cameras and your microphones are off. You'll have noticed, no doubt, but you can still participate through the chat, and we'd encourage you to use the chat function for any comments that you want to make or relevant links, etc. There will be an opportunity to ask questions today of our guests. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function. If you'd rather be anonymous when you ask that question, there's a box that you can check when prompted, so that you can choose not to have your name mentioned should you prefer. To help our panel to get through the questions today, please make sure that you're concise, and we are aiming to have plenty of time for Q&A. We're going to wrap up today's session slightly early, so we aim to be done by about 20 to 2, but there will still be plenty of time for your questions. Today's event is being recorded, so for anybody who's catching up later or can't quite make the whole time, you can catch up later. It will be shared on the Beyond Measure website and on the Cultural Institute YouTube channel, and we're hoping to have those uploaded by the end of the week, and by that time they will be captioned as well. So fingers crossed we won't have any technical issues. If we do, if you're struggling with anything, please do drop my colleague Yasmin Sudani a message. You can drop her a direct message in the chat and she will do her very best to help you. Before I hand over to today's chair, I'd like to give a brief overview of the Beyond Measure programme. So Beyond Measure is a programme of events that's co-produced between the Cultural Institute and the Leeds Arts Health and Wellbeing Network and the Centre for Cultural Value based at University of Leeds. We began in May by asking people what topics they'd be interested to see covered under the broad umbrella of research and evidence in culture and health. And by July, we distilled these into 3 Twitter chats, one on the role of the artist practitioner, which was chaired by Nicola Naismith, one on ethics and equity, chaired by Mafwa Theatre, and one on unpicking who research and evidence is for, which was chaired by Centre for Cultural Value and the Audience Agency. You can catch up with those discussions online and read reflective blogs written by their hosts. In June, we invited artists to creatively respond to the themes of Beyond Measure, and we were lucky enough to be able to commission 10 responses, and those covered media such as ceramics, dance, gardening and poetry, and I urge you to have a look at the gallery of those on the Beyond Measure website to catch up on what people produced. Just this week, we've had a programme of creativity on prescription facilitated by the Art Doctors for a small cohort of health sector professionals and trainees who undertook action research to understand more about how creativity can make a difference to their personal and professional lives. And we look forward to sharing with you all a video and article about that project, which will all be released by the end of this week. And we will talk more about it next week as well through our website and our Twitter. I should have mentioned, if anybody's tweeting today, please use the hashtag Beyond Measure, and that's also a good way to catch up on other conversations that have happened through previous events this week and throughout the whole lifespan of Beyond Measure. So let's crack on with today's event. I would like to hand over to our chair for the day, who's Professor Viv Jones. She is the current chair of the Cultural Institute, and she will introduce herself in more detail. Enjoy today's event, and I'll see you at the end. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Erica. So as Erica says, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Vivian Jones. I was previously a Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Leeds, and I have the privilege at the moment of chairing the University's Cultural Institute. But it's a particular privilege today to introduce our speakers. We're absolutely delighted to have with us 2 people well known to many of you, who couldn't be better qualified to round off the important and timely Beyond Measure programme in this, our final webinar. Darren Henley is the Chief Executive of Arts Council England, a post he has held since 2014. He has degrees and qualifications in politics, applied positive psychology, management and history of art, and his doctorate explored the role of the outsider as an agent for change. Before joining the Arts Council, he worked for many years and in many roles for Classic FM, latterly as Managing Director, and he's conducted independent reviews of cultural education for the UK and Scottish governments. Darren has written 30 books, many of them on music, but more recently, and perhaps better known to many of us, key interventions on the role and value of the arts. In 2014, he co-authored The Virtuous Circle, Why Creativity and Cultural Education Count, Creativity, Why It Matters was published in 2018. And The Arts Dividend, Why Investment in Culture Pays was first published in 2015. And a new edition, The Arts Dividend Revisited, was published just this year. Darren was awarded the British Academy President's Medal for contributions to music education, music research, and the arts. Daisy Fancourt is Associate Professor of Psychobiology and Epidemiology at University College London. Following degrees from Oxford and King's College London, Daisy did postdoctoral work in collaboration with the Royal College of Music in the Centre for Performance Science at Imperial College. And in 2017, she moved to UCL as a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow. Her work focuses on the positive impacts of community participation in the arts, particularly music, on the physical and mental health in people of all ages. She's a consultant to the WHO on the connections between arts, health and well-being, and her work has shown, among many other things, how, for example, singing in a choir can improve outcomes in pulmonary disease. The importance of Daisy's research has been recognised in a number of prestigious awards. In 2016, a British Science Association Jacob Bronowski Award Lecture for Science and the Arts. And in 2017, she received a British Academy Engagement Award and was named as a World Economic Forum Global Shaper and a BBC Radio 3 New Generation Thinker. In response to the COVID pandemic, Daisy established the network COVID Minds, which looks to better understand the impact of coronavirus on mental health and well-being. And she leads the COVID-19 social study, looking at the social experiences of UK adults during the pandemic, the results of which influence policymakers and the media in understanding the impact of lockdown. So I'm sure our speakers will have lots to talk about and you will have lots of questions for them. Enough from me, and I'm delighted to hand over to Darren and Daisy.
Viv, thank you very much. Just to check that you can hear us both. I'm presuming you can, so I'm going to keep going. Thank you very much for inviting us along today, and I think it's hugely impressive what you've done over the last few days around Beyond Measure, and you know, the Cultural Institute and all the work at the Centre of Cultural Value is something that the Arts Council we really value and have a huge sense of excitement about. So really brilliant the work that the University of Leeds is doing in leading the way with this. It's a great pleasure to be able to be here today to help you to hear more from Daisy, and I'm fascinated, and I think probably as a researcher her work is so relevant to all of what we do in our normal day-to-day lives, but particularly with all of the things that are going on in the world right now with COVID. So I'm fascinated to hear what she has to say. I mean, Daisy, it strikes me that you work at the intersection of science and art. In your mind, which of these is preeminent?
Well, I guess methodologically my training is as a scientist, but the core focus of what I do is looking at the impact of the arts. And I don't think it's necessarily a case of one of these taking predominance over the other. I think it's about how we bring these things together and use science to understand art and use art to understand science better as well.
And when you're co-designing something, working with artists and scientists, and often some of your work works within the medical area of science as well, what are the challenges you go through in that co-design process?
To be honest, I tend to think of the co-design as more of an enjoyable thing rather than something that brings up challenges, because I think the studies that I've worked on, the ones where we've had a proper synergistic collaboration between arts and science, have been the ones where we've had by far the best outcomes. I think sometimes you can get science studies where there isn't that arts involvement. Particularly, you sometimes see this if we look back a decade or so, especially at some of the earlier studies that looked at things like how music affects people within clinical settings. And often you found that it was scientists or doctors who were passionate about the arts designing these studies, but not necessarily bringing in artists themselves. And actually, as we've evolved from that and we've now got these proper studies that really use artists to design the arts interventions, I think the quality of that has really grown exponentially. I guess there are always some challenges that people are used to talking about, things like language and how that can be so different between the sectors. But that also feels like something where in the last few years, there's been so much of a bridging between these disciplines. And I think a recognition that the science world and medicine benefits so much from arts, as well as the arts sector being able to benefit from this engagement within the health sector, that it really is a relationship where both sides are equal winners from being involved.
It's interesting to explore that relationship. What do you feel each group brings to the other? What does each learn from the other?
Well, I guess if we're looking at this in the context of health interventions or the use of the arts within health, even within public health, then what we're seeing from the arts increasingly is the evidence that these are behaviours that have such profound effects on our mental and physical health, both on the prevention of problems, but also in managing and treating symptoms. And I think this is something that's been recognised within the health sector so much over the last decades, that it's about looking beyond medicine to these wider aspects of our life and behaviours in order to really promote good health. But I also think from the other side, seeing the imagination and creativity of the arts and cultural sector in designing activities that can support very specific clinical groups or try and target very specific outcomes. It's been remarkable how much we've seen these very sophisticated programs now developing that are really able to get at very niche physical or psychological points that we want to improve, and use the arts and their versatility to really address these in a very comprehensive way.
If there's someone watching us today who's starting out with that blank sheet of paper, has that good idea, thinks this is something that should be researched, and wants to, probably from an arts point of view, and may have not worked with somebody from a science background before, what would the tips be that you would give them? How should they go about populating that blank sheet of paper in a meaningful way?
I think the best thing by far is connections and collaborations. And unfortunately, there are so many networks now and opportunities to meet others who have got that similar enthusiasm, who might be coming from other angles. We've got things like the Arts Health Early Career Research Network, which is now around 1,400 early career researchers around the world involved, all coming at this from different positions, some of them as medics, some of them as scientists, some of them as artists or other community practitioners. I also think it's worth looking to good practice from what's happening in other organisations. So trying to visit as many programmes. I realise we're limited in that with COVID, but still trying to get a sense of what else is happening. And there are great opportunities this next year, such as the International Culture, Health and Wellbeing Conference, which will be online, which will give a great place for people to find out what other projects are going on and then be able to link up and find out more. And I think we're also seeing a lot more training and development opportunities now for people who want to come in and actually get more of a formal guidance into how to learn about this field, so that they're coming in with a really good foundational understanding of how to work in this space.
And of course, data and robust evidence is very important for science, but particularly when we go into the medical sphere, when we're talking about human beings' lives and health and well-being, it's even more important. Can you just reflect a little bit on that? So for an arts practitioner who needs to be able to get comfortable and to have integrity within the medical world, what advice could you give them?
Again, I think collaboration is key. I think if we look back a decade or so, I think there were concerns that every individual had to be able to do every part of this process. They had to be able to give the arts input and design the science themselves and run the analyses and speak at conferences and even lead the arts sessions themselves. But that's not really how we work, well, either within the arts or within science. Both are very collaborative sectors. And we're used to seeing arts projects that have got lots of people involved collaborating to bring them to fruition. And it's identical in science. Most science papers have got lots of authors who are all bringing specific expertise together. And I think that's what we need to think about within arts and health research, is that if you're someone who wants to be leading research projects as an artist, or if you're a researcher who wants to be leading those projects, bringing the arts component in, then not feeling like you have to do this alone. Absolutely go ahead and get the training so that you feel you're upskilling in whatever part of that might be new to you, but make sure you're bringing on those other experts who can guide you or work collaboratively with you on running that project.
And of course, in the scientific, normal R&D within the science world, actually having things that you test hypotheses and they fail is a really important part of that process. I sometimes wonder in the arts world whether we're as comfortable with that. We want everything to work every time. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
It's interesting you say that, because there's often within science, it's often reassuring when some things fail, because it makes you then realize that when things work, that is special in itself. And I think sometimes it's a bit concerning if you're getting results that are looking too good, because it suggests something might have gone wrong somewhere in that process. So I think we shouldn't be scared of failure. And I think especially within arts and health, this field has become so well established over the last couple of decades. I don't think we're in the position that we used to be in, which was when people didn't even necessarily believe that arts and health were two words that should be going together. I feel like we've made huge steps from the phenomenal work of people in this field over the last couple of decades. So I think we can now be more confident as we talk about this and as we approach this work. And therefore, when there are things that don't work, be able to say, well, that's okay. That's part of this process. And what you learn from failure is often much greater than what you learn from success.
And a lot of your work, both internationally and nationally, is working with policymakers, and so not necessarily with an outcome that's directly going to be seized upon by medics or other people in science. It's actually there about thinking about policy making decisions for the long term. What have you learned about how you can effectively frame research output for policymakers?
It's been really interesting doing more policy work over the last probably 5 years or so, because it's a very different way of thinking. I think when we're within research or within practice, we're used to looking at every individual study, for example, and critiquing the specific details of that study to try and work out if we're happy with the evidence from that. You're looking often in a very in-depth way. Whereas with policy, it's all about taking a step back and looking at that bigger picture. Policymakers are rarely interested in the outcomes of one specific study. What they're really interested in generally is looking at the aggregate outcomes from all of the evidence on a particular topic. So you're taking that step back, and it starts to mean that instead of looking at each study on its own, you're actually starting to say, well, as a whole, is this evidence base as a collective strong enough, consistent enough, applicable enough, generalizable enough? And that means that often the tools that you're using for critiquing studies are very different to those that you'd be using within research-based systematic reviews or meta-analyses or meta-ethnographies or meta-syntheses. But I also think it's a very different process within policy, because you lose a lot of the freedom that you have academically or artistically earlier on when you're designing research projects or you're designing arts activities. You're often given incredibly specific briefs about what's wanted. Often you're even told paragraph by paragraph what they want the content to be. There are very specific questions. What we're seeing now is that many policy documents end up in the public domain, which I think is really positive because other people can see what's happening. But often these are documents that are being created for a specific meeting with a specific question, like, what should we spend this budget on? Is it worth pursuing this topic in the next financial year? So it's a very different way of working. But I think it's really helpful to understand that, because it's certainly informed my work as a researcher to be able to see how research papers later on can get used within policy documents and policy decisions.
So that process sounds like it has the potential to challenge the integrity both of the researcher, the scientist, and also the artist. So how do you guard against that? How do you keep it pure?
Can you tell me a bit more about what you mean about the integrity point there?
Well, I suppose it's the question around when you say that there's very detailed instructions at the front end. If a policymaker could be commissioning something with an output in mind, so to speak, and that could really pressurize the researchers and the participants to go down a certain pathway, which may not be always the best one. And I suppose it's how you bring that rigor and challenge into that process.
Yes, I understand. So I think often the questions that come through from policy are still quite open. It'll be around, is it worth pursuing this topic or not? So then it's still about weighing up where how strong you think the evidence base is, or whether you think that there is enough to pursue that particular topic. Sometimes there are opportunities to be able to sort of say, well, this doesn't look as strong, but actually this area could be an alternative. And I think the main thing is about just ensuring that when we're looking at evidence and when we're not necessarily going in with own agendas. I think that's a big thing with policy, is having to put aside your own agenda in terms of what you think should happen, or even your views, for example, on which government you're working with and whether you think that you'd do it totally differently if you were in their seat, for example. So there's quite a lot in that in terms of stepping back and trying to make sure that you're not emotionally connected to the decisions that are being made there.
It's very interesting that, because we first met many moons ago, and we fascinating fact for everyone, we made some albums together a long time ago, and so I know you're a very proficient musician. So you care very passionately about music, and you know, and you've studied it to a very high level. So obviously you're going to have personally a set of views around music and its value. How do you you know, and I think it's something I know, you know, every day at the Arts Council, I meet artists and people who run arts organisations and creative practitioners of all sorts, and they're very passionate and they've seen all of that anecdotal evidence and they know that this stuff works, but sometimes we don't have the data to show it. So how do you park that at the door and go in and think, I've actually got to be rigorous here because actually that's better for the end outcome? What would you advise people to do?
I think it comes from that point that I was making earlier around feeling confident in the sector and the evidence that's come so far, and therefore feeling that we can move forward without necessarily having to think, particularly as a researcher, not trying to think you're doing this in terms of advocacy, but instead thinking of yourself more as an explorer. And I think one of the things that I love about science so much is that the types of questions that I find fascinating aren't necessarily the ones about saying, does this work or not? But they're ones about saying, well, why is this working? Is it always going to work? Is it going to work better with some people than others? Is the context around it going to change? So those, I think, are those richer questions that actually are things that you don't necessarily know. You might have some intuition on, but not really anything that you can be really confident on. And so those are the questions that now really excite me, because they're the things that will advance what we all know, not just the ones like I think we can all be pretty confident we have enough research and also our own experiences that the arts improve well-being, for example. So showing that again, whilst that's obviously still really important in certain ways, that's a less, for me, interesting question than trying to understand those mechanisms and those moderators about why and when that's happening.
So just hearing you talk about the questions that excite you, what is the great unanswered question in this area that really excites you at the moment?
Oh, that changes all the time for me. I think a few years ago, I would have probably said that it was all about the biological side. So trying to understand how arts activities were affecting immune function, brain activity, hormones, this kind of thing. I think in the last few years, it's really moved to looking at data and trying to see at population levels, how strong are these effects? How long do they last? Which groups are we seeing them in? And I think now I'm probably got lots of different things. I'm getting particularly interested in trying to look at things like the epigenetics of this. So trying to see not just biologically how the arts affect our hormones or our immune function, but actually seeing if they're moderating the way that our genes are being expressed within our bodies. And this might sound quite far-fetched, but it's been shown a lot now from other kinds of activities and interventions and experiences. Things like loneliness affects how much our genes are being turned on and off, these genes that might increase our risk of things like depression. So it's taking that biological sense down to a really deep level. But we're seeing, for example, from rats, studies of rats, that if they're in enriched environments with colour and noise and lights around them, then they're actually affecting what's happening to their gene expression. So it makes sense that we might well be seeing this from arts activities as well. So I think for me, it's always about finding what the next frontier is that's affecting similar exposures, like social exposures, like physical activity, like other leisure, and considering whether we can apply this to arts as well and what that'll teach us.
And it's interesting, you talked about earlier on about collaboration and community and connections. Within this area of scientific research, where are we in the UK, and how does it paint a picture for us of how it works internationally as well?
I feel like in the UK, the structures that we've now got are absolutely phenomenal. I mean, things like the Culture, Health and Wellbeing Alliance, this Centre for Cultural Value at Leeds, the Royal Society for Public Health and their special interest group in arts, the All-Party Parliamentary Group. I know from lots of the colleagues that I work with internationally that they're quite jealous that we've managed to get many of these things up to such strong levels, and that we're also seeing this bridging across with things like social prescribing and arts being used within that. In terms of other countries, it seems to work very differently in each place depending on how that country's health system or arts sectors are set up. There are some examples that I think are particularly inspiring. For example, in Nordic countries, their use of arts on prescription and social prescribing trials in different areas, whilst not necessarily at the same national scale as ours, have been incredibly clever. And they're working between different ministries for arts, education and health is something that I think we can really aspire to. And I think as well, for example, in the US, the work that's being done within hospitals and increasingly looking at public health, trying to use the arts as ways of tackling big challenges like racism is really fantastic, and I think pushing new boundaries there. And similarly, if we look to Europe, there are countries like Germany where their work on the kind of neuroscientific aspects of music and the arts has been absolutely groundbreaking in the last few years. So I think there really are, and that's only picking out a few, it's by no means suggesting the others aren't doing equally exciting things. But I think it's really nice to see all of these things developing organically in each country, but also seeing that increased interconnection between countries. I guess a big question on my mind is how that's going to evolve post-COVID, because a lot of that sharing has happened through things like face-to-face conferences in the past. So I guess I'm wondering how we can keep adapting that if we might be in a world that's less keen on as much travel over the next few years.
And is there a process where internationally people are in competition, or is it much more of a community where people are learning and building up from each other?
To me, it's always felt more like the latter, so that community of learning and building. Because I think competition tends to arise when there's some scarcity of something like funding or resources. And given that most of the funding and resources is still within each country rather than pooled internationally, I think it's so far felt that it's been much more about learning from each other and trying to connect and to have those opportunities to collaborate more. And I hope that's something that stays, because it's something that's marked the sector out in such a lovely way over the last few years. And it's certainly to work in it, feeling like you've got friends and supporters and collaborators around, I think is such a wonderful environment, especially for people who are starting out early in careers or setting up new arts organisations or projects.
And you talked then just a moment ago about social prescribing. It'd be good to just tease out some more around that. For us at the Arts Council, it's very important. We're working in partnership with the Department of Health, and there's a new National Academy for social prescribing, and it feels like this is something that is really gaining some traction. What's your reflections on that?
I feel like this is definitely gaining traction. Again, it feels like the events in the last year have perhaps derailed to a certain extent where we thought things were going to go. But something that's very interesting is with my colleagues in NHS England, we've been working on this dashboard so you can see social prescribing referrals in real time. And it's been remarkable seeing how much they've increased across the pandemic, and that actually something that's put so much pressure on the core health service is at the same time brought to the fore how much we need things like social prescribing to be able to support what else is happening within the NHS. I think as we move beyond COVID, we've seen a lot of increases in things like mental health problems and people who face really difficult circumstances. So I think there's going to be a more important role than ever before for social prescribing. So I'm hoping that we can see that move forwards, but of course in recognition of the fact that so many, particularly within the arts sector, have suffered so much over the last few months. I think a concern is, will we have those projects available for people to be referred to?
And obviously your work over the last 9 months has pivoted a lot towards COVID, and you've responded, as Viv said in the introduction. Can you just give us an oversight of where that work is at the moment?
Yes, because a lot of my work is on arts and health, but I've also got other strands of it that look at other kinds of social interventions or activities, things like loneliness, social isolation, and other kinds of community engagements. And so it was really in response to that background of work that when the pandemic started, we realised there was going to be a need to look at these broader psychological and social experiences. And I think especially early on, I saw the first dashboards coming out of Public Health England showing cases and deaths, but that only gives one part of the picture. And a big concern I had with my team was that we weren't going to have the same kind of real-time reporting on the wider impact of this pandemic, that actually were likely to affect many more people than the virus itself was going to. So we started this study in March to track in real time and be able to report to policymakers and decision makers in real time how the public was being affected. And we've had 72,000 people taking part in the study every single week since. So we're over 800,000 completed surveys over the last 9 months. It's the largest study of its kind globally. And it's been really rewarding to be able to produce, we're analysing data in real time, so to produce these weekly reports and dozens of extra analyses for different policy groups every single week, as well as scientific papers showing how people are being affected, who is most at risk, and also crucially what could be done to support those groups. So it's very much been a privilege to work on.
So can you give us some insight into, I mean, obviously there's huge research outputs in there, but can you give us some insights in some of the interesting or exciting or surprising headlines that come out of it?
Well, one of the things that was really surprising early on was that the way that people responded psychologically to this pandemic was completely different from how it was predicted. When we've had previous epidemics, so things like SARS, MERS, H1N1, Ebola, what we've found is that people's mental health has got worse if they've had to go into quarantine. So across that quarantine period of a few weeks, let's say, depression levels have consistently got higher. Whereas what we actually found in COVID was that people's mental health got worse before they went into lockdowns. And as soon as lockdowns came in the UK and actually globally, many people actually found that their anxiety and depression stabilized or even started to improve. And in fact, we'd also had these concerns early on that it was going to be older adults who'd be worse affected by this, most isolated, the worst mental health responses. Whereas we found the opposite. Actually, it's younger adults. And again, we're finding this globally now, who've been the worst affected by this pandemic. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, it's a pandemic as opposed to an epidemic. So we've all gone through the same physical exposures like lockdowns at the same time. So there's not been necessarily the sense that everyone else is having a great time, but you're not. And I think that's really differentiated it from previous epidemics. There's also, I think, been the fact that so many measures were brought in, whilst not necessarily going far enough to solve the hardships people have faced. Those measures, again, have helped to stabilize things that haven't necessarily happened in previous epidemics. So it's shown it's a very different exposure, but also as we're now heading into different lockdowns, we're finding it's not the same pattern as in that first lockdown. So I think it's shaking up our understanding of how periods of isolation actually affect people and highlighting that it's not the same pattern every time, but actually these contexts, these moderators play a huge role in terms of how we're actually experiencing them and responding.
And do you think out of that data, I mean, let's hope there's never another pandemic like this, but were there to be one, that there will be concrete things that will be different, that governments around the world will now, in the knowledge of the research you've done, be able to do things in a different way?
I hope so. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to identify what needs to happen in the future, what the learnings from this are, so that we're better prepared, because the truth is there probably will be another one at some point, not necessarily the same in scale or in terms of what the virus is like, but we've seen a number of epidemics over the last couple of decades. So we have to be better prepared next time. So a lot of this isn't just about monitoring now what's happening in real time now, but it's about getting things prepared so that we've got a system in place, knowing what support's needed, who's most likely to experience those particularly adverse responses and how we can support them.
And specifically around the relationship that individuals have had with artists or arts organisations, what have you learned over the last few months?
For me, it's felt like a very odd paradox, because on the one hand, the arts sector has faced this unprecedented closure of everything, as well as so many organisations struggling, having to shut down, the huge impact on individuals, which we've been researching actually as part of our study. But at the same time, the arts have seemed absolutely fundamental to people's coping during this pandemic. I mean, if we look back on early March when we were having the first lockdown in Italy, the thing that was going viral was videos of people singing from their balconies. When we went into lockdown, it was people painting rainbows to stick on their windows, or joining the sudden outpouring of live streamings of theatre productions or virtual choirs or book clubs. So the arts was something that we were turning to, and our research has actually highlighted how much turning to those things was helping with psychological coping, and how that psychological coping was helping people to recover faster from symptoms of anxiety and depression. But I feel like this shouldn't have been a shock, because if we look back historically, whenever there have been huge upheavals, things like world wars, the arts are something that again have shown themselves to be so fundamental. But it feels odd that whenever we have these kinds of shocks, we seem to forget very quickly and go back to thinking that, or some people go back to thinking that the arts are a kind of nice to have rather than a necessary, and that they're not essential in these global emergencies. I'm really hoping that this time we'll remember how much people needed the arts. But that's where this paradox comes in, and the arts have been so important, but the arts sector itself seems to have experienced so much suffering because of what's happened. And I think what we've seen globally is differences in some countries where there's been more support compared to other countries where there's been less, even though the global response from individuals of needing the arts seems to have been pretty homogenous.
So it's interesting hearing what you're saying there. Lots of very positive outputs for audiences or participants. Have you done any work that actually looks at those practitioners, at the providers, the artists, if you like, and how they've been coping over the last 9 months?
We have, and in fact, we've got some research that's due out very shortly where we've been interviewing a number of freelancers within the arts sector to find out how they've been affected. What they've been talking to us about has been the challenges for their own work, but also the kind of more existential worries that they now have about how to move forwards. As in, will they be able to carry on? Will there be too much competition, even more challenge to get funding as a result of this? Might this start to widen some of the inequalities, for example, based on ethnic background in terms of being able to carry on that kind of work, or based on socioeconomic position of being in a place where you can afford to be trying to start out from scratch again? Also, I think what's come through very strongly is that this wasn't just for many people a case of their work disappearing, but it was also a case about their identities being challenged. People who identify as an artist feeling like they're not sure if that identity is still them anymore. But also many artists telling us that for them, art and pleasure bleed together, so that their social networks, their friendships are often connected to their work. And therefore, when their work has been taken away, they've often felt those social networks also being threatened. So increasing isolation because of not being able to do their job at a personal level. So there have been lots of these particularly nuanced understandings about how people have been affected coming through, which seem to be particularly linked in with people who work within these creative industry roles.
It's interesting, isn't it? One of the things I've observed over the last few months is, and we and probably everybody who's in this meeting are quite passionate about well-being and about people's happiness and living better lives and understanding how the arts and cultural activities can make that happen. But it does strike me that even more so popular media now, talking about well-being, talking about mental health, talking about loneliness has become much more socially acceptable. And I wonder if that's something that will be one of the things that we can hold on to as a positive that's come out of what we've all been through over the last few months.
I really hope so too. I share that hope, but I think I have a couple of concerns as well. One of them is that because we all started off in this, I hated the phrase all in this together, because I felt there was a lovely analogy I saw which was saying we're in the same storm but different boats. And yes, we all started going through the same kinds of exposures, like lockdown coming in the UK for everyone at once. But not everyone was facing that in the same way. So I think while some people found that lockdown was this chance to do all these creative activities, for others, lockdown was an absolute nightmare and wasn't a time when they felt they had any of that creative energy to do anything else for themselves. And I think as we've moved forward, we've seen a sort of increasing fractions within society, particularly now we've got different areas and different stages of lockdown, which we're completely not in it all together, either individually or in terms of the circumstances we're going through. And as a result, we're finding that people aren't responding in the same broad ways psychologically to what's happening. For some people, this just feels like it's a bit boring and it's dragging on. For other people, the last few months have been so horrendous financially or in terms of employment or whatever, or in terms of bereavements too, that this is now a completely different experience. So in terms of mental health, I think a lot of research, including stuff we've been doing, we're asked to look at things like average results across the country. And that as a whole looks like it's better than it was 9 months ago. But that, of course, obscures what's happening at individual levels. And I guess my concern is that because many people are coping better than they were before, many people are excited about the reopening of society when we get vaccinated, I think that doesn't mean everyone's in that same place. And I'm worried that some might start to feel even more isolated or mental health if they're finding things particularly tough, or if for some reason the prospect of returning to a more normal life is actually one that fills them with fear or dread. So I'm hoping that we'll continue being sensitive to how everyone's feeling as opposed to just how the majority are responding.
I want to move on to some of your other areas of work, but just a final sort of COVID-related question. It would be wrong to have an epidemiologist in the room and not ask it. What's your prognosis for the year ahead?
It's really hard to tell. So I think the main thing is not thinking that there is a hard and fast expectation as to what's going to happen. I think the vaccine news that we've had recently is really promising. So I think I share the hope of many other scientists that we will see improvements and particularly be able to be socializing more next year. I think the early months of next year are going to be very, very tough in terms of managing to contain the virus. Even if people are starting to be vaccinated, it'll take a long time for that to come into a level that is really reducing the cases. And I also think that there are going to be more challenges both in the process of vaccinating, and trying to vaccinate millions of people, tens of millions of people is no mean feat. So we have to recognize how difficult that's going to be, but also in terms of the reopening of society, that isn't just going to be a case where the doors open again and everything feels like it's normal. And I think there'll also be this process of readjustment for individuals that we ourselves might not have yet understood how that's going to affect us. So I think I'm optimistic but cautious about exactly when the timescale for everything will be and when things will actually start to feel like normal again and what that normal will be.
Thank you. So moving on to another big body of your work, you work with the WHO and done a lot of work with them. Can you just share some of that so we understand the scope of your activities with them?
It was really wonderful and it's really wonderful working with WHO, because having that kind of very high level health body, the highest level health body interested in this topic, I think is a real badge of achievement for this sector and for those who've been working in it for long before I joined as well, in terms of getting everything to this stage where it can be taken as seriously as that. I feel like the relationship with WHO and then with this field is one that's only just beginning now, and it's going to be really exciting to see how that develops over the next few years. The initial engagement that I had with them was writing the WHO Arts and Health Evidence Synthesis Report, which was published about a year ago. And the brief that we had for that was to look broadly at all of the literature on different aspects of health. So including health prevention and health promotion, so how the arts might support with things like well-being, reducing potentially the incidence of mental health problems, but also playing a role in things like social cohesion and education and health communication. And then also looking at management and treatments of health conditions and the role that the arts could play there. And I think this is another example, as we were speaking earlier, about policy documents and what they're being raised for. The point of this from the WHO was to have a document so that they could say to their 53 member states within the European region, there is a lot of evidence on this now. You should take this initial document and start your own work. So identifying whether you want to do more specific policy reports or scoping reviews or systematic reviews, whether you want to start looking at developing your own recommendations or your own trial programs. So it was really just a way for them to be able to say, this is something that we think is worth you getting behind more and exploring further. So again, we got very specific briefs from WHO in terms of what they wanted us to include, the style they wanted, the types of ways they wanted us to look at evidence, and the types of ways they wanted us to look at policy recommendations as a result of this. But already we're seeing so much response from different countries. So for example, we found that within Nordic countries, there's the Nordic Council of Ministers who've been convening on this topic. We know that there are healthcare commissioners in Sweden who've been grouping together and working as a result of this. In Finland, there are multiple ministries who are collaborating to develop plans in response to the report. And we're also seeing some developments within the UK as well. So it's been really exciting that it's sparked a lot of this activity. And I'm sort of looking forward to seeing where that goes over the next few years.
I'm very curious, you talk about the two sort of big pots of activity, if you like, the prevention and then the management. Just expand on that a little bit for us.
Well, I think sometimes, again, if we look back a decade or two as well, I think if you said to someone about arts and health, the thing that people had heard the most about was things like music therapy and arts therapy. And I think that's expanded as we've had growing recognition for other kinds of arts activities within health, and particularly sort of programs within hospitals or other kinds of healthcare settings. But I think what's also been coming alongside this is this growing public awareness of arts within community settings and the role that they can play that might not necessarily seem like health on the surface, because it might be things like education work or work within prisons or work within deprived local areas. But all of these things that actually are playing a fundamental role in our health, because these are determinants of our health. So we wanted to look very broadly at health in that way, not reducing it just to a medical model where you'd be looking at an intervention that's come with a particular health aim, but looking at the more kinds of general engagement and even ubiquitous daily engagement that we might do with no health purposes in mind, but purely for our own enjoyment, but things that happen to have those health and well-being benefits.
And some of the research in this area is attributed grade A, and there's really strong outcomes. So, for example, improving, reducing physical decline in old age, or improving well-being in adults, and some of it isn't quite as good as that. Can you just give us some insights on what makes good research?
Well, what's interesting is when we did the WHO report, they actually didn't want us to look at quality within that first report. We're actually doing a second piece of work with them that's looking at quality through that, but they very much wanted a scoping review that would look at what kind of evidence is out there, what kinds of topics have been explored, rather than critiquing the quality of those individual studies. But what's very interesting is in response to that, not only are we taking forward the quality work in a different way with WHO, although that has been slightly delayed by what's happened over the last 9 months with COVID, but the response from, for example, UK government with DCMS was that they wanted something that would look at the quality in response to the WHO report, which is exactly what we'd anticipated with that first report. So seeing it more as a catalyst rather than the end products in itself. But I think this comes back to that point around policy versus research critique. And in research, we're used to seeing certain hierarchies of evidence. For better or for worse, these often place things like a randomized control trial at the top of a pyramid, and they'll place things like a case study at the bottom. I say for better or for worse because these are contentious issues that aren't necessarily as simple as that. But policy is very different. They're not necessarily interested in each individual study in its own way. They don't really want a critique of each paper. They want to look at this broad picture, that step back that I mentioned earlier. So the types of things that they were interested in were how consistent the evidence was. So there might be different studies of different levels of quality within them, but are they all coming to the same kinds of conclusions? And something we do know within science is that it's often quite strong if you've got different studies with different methodologies. Every study has limitations. Even the best randomized control trial has got limitations. It might be very specific in the population you work with, or very short-term in follow-up, let's say. But if you're triangulating that with other studies that have used different approaches that cancel out those weaknesses, then you start to get this richer picture. They were also interested in things like generalizability. If lots of studies have all been conducted in very tightly controlled settings, then that might make a very rigorous study, but that might not be applicable to a messy real world setting. So the need to have studies that have looked at that mess within them, and also applicability, whether the things that have been studied are things that could be intervened on in a meaningful way within policy. So it was different kinds of criteria that get requested for these policy reports compared to what we're used to seeing in things like research-based systematic reviews.
And a lot of people who are with us today from an arts background will be used to coming to an organisation like mine, coming to the Arts Council, understand what we would want to if we were investing in a project or funding something. A lot of the outputs that might be researched here would actually be aimed ultimately at potentially clinical commissioners who would hold budgets that would mean that once the data is there to show evidence, that they could be commissioned and funded in the future. What advice could you give someone from the arts world who's having to work to make the case to someone from a medical background? What's the medical person looking for?
You mean in terms of the kind of evaluation or research project around there?
So if you were a clinical commissioner, they're looking for confidence and saying, actually, I will put my budget into this arts project because I believe it's robust, the data is there. How best for the artist to frame that?
I think it always really depends on who your audience is. And I think that's a difference between if you're working, evaluating or researching a particular project where you've got some kind of end in mind, like getting commissioning, versus if you're working as a researcher where you're looking at this more for the research questions. And so I think if you're someone who's doing the former of those, it's worth knowing what kind of evidence those commissioners or that end audience wants, because there are so many different types of evidence, and different types of evidence speak to different people. From my work with commissioners, I know that they've often wanted quite traditional scientific models like randomized control trials, where they can see if this is better than an alternative approach. That alternative approach might be no intervention, or it might be the best gold standard that we currently have. And I think it's important to know which one of these commissioners want to see. There's often a sense that any kind of intervention is better than nothing, but often they want to see more than that. Is it better to invest in your activity rather than what they might already be investing in? And I think a kind of prime example there is to consider things like the Breathe Magic program on hemiplegia, where they've been able to actually look at what they've done in relation to the previous best accepted method of dealing with hemiplegia. I also think often there are economic arguments that commissioners can sometimes want to see to actually understand if it's going to be worth their investment. And I think it can feel very reductive bringing things down to those kinds of numbers and putting prices on things. But for some audiences and commissioners, that can be what they need to see in order for the business case for them to stack up. And I think the challenge is when we're talking about hierarchies of evidence and things, people can start to think that because that's what some audiences are asking for, that's therefore the best, but it's not. And I think this is where that triangulation becomes key. in that for other audiences, completely different methods, qualitative methods, ethnographies, these kinds of things might be much more appropriate. And I feel like we need to keep that plurality of research methods going, because they all speak to different people, but they also all tell us different things.
So I'm going to hand over a moment to Viv and Eric, as I'm sure other people in the room have got loads of questions for you. But one final question from me. So for you, in your work going forward, what's going to be there in the next 12 months? What are you concentrating on? What are we going to be hearing from you over the coming months?
We've got a lot more big data work coming up. So using cohort studies, using other very large databases to try and look longitudinally at how these arts activities or arts engagement are associated with long-term health and well-being benefits. We've got a really interesting set of work that's trying to understand more as well about the context, so how this is affected by the area of deprivation that you might be living in, or your own personal mental health. We're trying to work out whether the people who could need this most are the ones who actually can benefit most from engagements. But also along that line, looking more at inequalities. They're trying to understand more about the barriers to engaging in the arts amongst different groups and how we could overcome those. We've also got some more of the biological work around epigenetics and genetics that I spoke about earlier, which is really exciting for me because that biological angle is what my PhD was on. It's very much a passion of mine. But we've also got some really exciting theory work coming up. We've got a paper that's being published very shortly, which is all about mechanisms of action. How is it that arts and other leisure activities actually affect our health? What are the processes that are involved? We've actually identified over 600 of these that have been proposed theoretically or tested empirically for leisure. And that paper's due out very shortly. And I think I'm excited about the theoretical discussions that we can be having as well, so that we're understanding this both from what's coming through from every new study that gets added in this field, but also what's coming through from having these kinds of frameworks that allow us to have a broad comprehension of how these arts activities fit within broader models of health.
Your research output is so voluminous, I don't know when you ever sleep, but thank you for sharing all of that with us today. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm going to hand back over to Viv and to Erica now, and I know that I'm sure there are lots of questions from other people in the room, but thank you, Daisy.
Thanks, Darren.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, there's more questions coming in as we speak, but I can have a look at what we've got in the box already. And the first one that we've had in is from somebody called Naomi. Daisy, do you have any general advice for visual artists wishing to upskill in order to better collaborate with scientists for the purpose of research?
If you're looking for kind of training opportunities, things like that, then there are a number of things I could recommend. If you go to the Royal Society for Public Health, then their Arts and Health Special Interest Group is definitely worth joining. There's actually on the website for that group, once you're a member, you can see a comprehensive list of all of the courses that you can go on around the country, so master's courses or undergraduate courses or PhD programs, where you could learn more about this in a really formal training environment. If you're interested in kind of shorter opportunities to upskill, then within the Arts Health Early Career Research Network, we offer lots of different opportunities. We promote things that are happening in different countries around the world, online courses. We've actually got a new online course that we're developing through UCL, through the MARCH Network. And we've also got our annual research intensive week for people who are interested in this topic, just to sort of learn a few more skills around research and theory and the current developments in policy and practice around the world. I'd also just suggest being on all the mailing lists for things like the Centre for Cultural Value and the Culture, Health and Wellbeing Alliance, because there are lots of opportunities that get promoted through those as well.
That's great, thank you. And a question here which picks up on your last conversation point with Darren, which is from Dawn Fuller, who says, what, if anything, is being done with the medical profession and commissioners to support them to understand and give equal value to plurality of evidence? And Dawn says, to date, that's not been my experience.
That's a really
I just wonder if you've got anything to say.
I do, yes. I feel like a lot is actually happening within the medical field on this at the moment, because the arts aren't unique in being these complex activities to research. And if we look at other kinds of public health interventions, exercise interventions, education-based interventions, they face a lot of the same kinds of complexities that we have within the arts. So we've seen a lot of things over the last few years that are trying to support this. Things like the Medical Research Council, MRC, having guidelines for complex interventions. things like evidence calls that are looking at plurality of methods from different research councils, and a particular focus on cross-disciplinary research funding, which is really coming through from UK Research and Innovation, which coordinates all of our research councils. I also think that within the training of medics, we're getting a lot more space being given often to these kinds of topics and activities. We've got things like social prescribing networks for trainee doctors that are trying to make sure they're really aware about this kind of topic and this field of work whilst they're in those training formative stages. And we're also seeing, I know from the courses that I teach on at UCL, the master's programs and the PhD programs, which are within my institute on things like epidemiology and behavioural science. We're actually finding increasing numbers of lectures and modules within those that look at things like arts and culture and other leisure-based or social activities. So there seems to be a gradual recognition of how exciting this field is from those other domains. It's always going to take time, and I think we can't expect things to necessarily get to the stage that we might want them to be at immediately, but I think we should see all of these signs as really encouraging and just keep continuing to promote the messages from the arts sector and from the arts and health work about the importance of that plurality of approach. Great,
thank you. And I've got a question here from my colleague Holly Danhauser, who works in the health partnerships team in Leeds, so she's from the health side of the fence as well. She says, this research sounds so incredibly valuable and impactful. Thank you for sharing this. I'm interested to know of examples of people or places that have used findings from research to make real and practical change to policy and decision making. So Daisy, if there's one or two examples that you might be able to talk about.
Well, really I think if we're looking at what's happened in the last 9 months, then you can see from SAGE documents and SPI-B documents, which are all available online, you can see when evidence has been cited. And as a scientist, it's been really exciting working on something where you can see your research papers going straight into these documents and being discussed in these meetings and being used to inform decisions on things. I mean, I guess the challenge is always that you never know how much policy is going to pick up on the suggestions or the recommendations or the points that have been raised within research. And that's always about those boundaries between science and policy, recognizing that scientists advise, but policymakers decide ultimately. But I guess if we're talking about arts and culture, a great win, I'd say, has been the mainstreaming of social prescribing over the last few years. And that's been the work of so many phenomenal individuals and organizations in getting that work recognized, making sure that it actually becomes part of funding and part of contracts within the Department of Health and Social Care and within the NHS. And that's something there, it sort of shows what happens when that hard work from those individuals takes place over years, that we're now in a position that we have probably the best sort of social prescribing national scheme in the entire world at the moment. So I think there can be amazing breakthroughs, but I think with policy it's always about patience and recognizing that it won't necessarily happen on the time scale that research might want it to.
Thank you. I'm moving on. We've got loads of questions in the Q&A, so I'm just whizzing through. We have one here from Deborah Munt, who says that given that the research is now based on what's happened in practice over the last few decades, the work of bloody-minded pioneers in practice, do you have any thoughts on the way that funding systems across health, culture and research could encourage future pioneering practice?
I'm really excited by when we've seen funding streams that have allowed funding to go to research and practice in parallel. And I think, again, if we look back, that's something that didn't used to happen so much. But if we consider, for example, Arts Council, who ran their funding stream a few years ago that allowed you to do projects with money going to researchers and money going to arts organisations in a genuinely equal collaborative relationship. And we're seeing that increasingly from research councils as well and from other funders, that this interest in dual funding practice and research. So I've seen those as encouraging moves. I think there's sometimes a challenge that funders have got very specific remits of what they're allowed to fund based on the money they're giving out. But I do think it's exciting that we're seeing those boundaries seeming to be breaking down a lot more. But I do recognise as well there can still be challenges in finding those sources of funding, and also the steps that are required to go through in order to unlock those funds can be enormous. So I'm not underestimating the amount of work that it is in order to access that, and how challenging that can be within third sector organisations, especially when it's slightly different from research, where you know that your job is always to be churning out these research applications all the time. But it can take up so much time from practitioners and from arts organisations to be doing that same kind of level of paperwork. But I'm hopeful on that one as well, that there'll be more opportunities for that.
And related to that, we've had a question from Mike Haydock at Create, who's talking about arts organisations and charities and what can they do better to support advocacy efforts around this work to continue to promote the value of the arts using rigorous evidence to persuade government.
I often think that people aren't necessarily aware of the research that's out there, and it's amazing I find it myself whenever I'm looking through keeping up to date with what papers have come out or researching for introductions or discussions for new papers, how many new things there are every month. So I think a big thing is trying to raise awareness of what that research is. So if people are going for funding or they're going for particular asks for things, being able to point to that evidence. And of course, every review that gets done, things like the Creative Health Report or the WHO reports, they're out of date the day they're published. So I think continuing to be able to use things like that to look retrospectively, but also being able to point to the new evidence that's coming out all the time to show that there is evidence there. I think a big question for a long time in this field was, where's the evidence? And I think we can now point to big summaries, but we can also point to the ever accumulating research. A challenge, of course, is staying on top of that. But there are things like the Culture, Health and Wellbeing Alliance and the March Network newsletters. We have research updates every month of samples of new research that come out. And there are lots of tools online for helping to stay on top of research papers as well. So I definitely recommend using those to make sure that individually we're all up to date.
Thank you. And talking about evidence, we've had a question about big data. This is from Rick Shaw at the Bradford City of Culture Bid 2025. He would be interested to know where Daisy thinks might be some good examples of the use of big data. The Born in Bradford cohort obviously offers huge promise, but there are other examples of large-scale big data research. Are there any, examples of other large-scale big data research that you know of in the UK or around the world?
Absolutely, yes. This is one of my favourite topics. And what's been fascinating to me is discovering a few years ago that basically most countries have got cohort studies where they've been following individuals, representative samples of individuals, regularly every few years across their entire lives, tracking so many aspects, psychologically, behaviourally, medically, educationally, financially, how people have been living. And what was fascinating to discover was that the majority of these cohorts around the world have also gathered information on arts and other leisure activities. So they've often got data going back decades showing what people have been doing in terms of their arts engagements, alongside incredibly rich data on these other outcomes, including health outcomes. And so with my team at UCL, we have a very large program of work that analyses data from 7 of the major cohort studies within the UK. So we've published 70 or 80 papers in this space over the last few years, using big data to understand the relationship between arts and health outcomes at this population level. We're also working with Born in Bradford at the moment, actually, on gathering new data within that particular cohort that would enable us to look at the relationship between arts and health in Bradford in a greater way. And there are also lots of these cohorts in other countries. We've got a new program with the University of Florida in the US, where we're analysing a whole range of US cohort studies, doing the same kinds of complex statistical analyses to understand what this long-term relationship is. So there's definitely a lot of data out there, but I think a lot of it's just been quite untapped so far. So it's quite an exciting space to be in.
Thank you. And relatedly, I think there's a question from Holly Marland about the cohorts that take part in research studies and how we can make sure that they are representative of the population.
Yes, this is an important point. I can see Holly's asked about ethnically representative here, and I think the majority of these cohorts are representative, but a challenge here is that if we're looking, for example, in the UK at ethnicity, and we're trying to look at people who are from Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, that's only around 11-12% of the population. So statistically, that's sometimes not enough people, even if you're looking at it at a representative way. So sometimes what you find with these cohorts is they actually oversample from groups they think might be minority groups, so that you've got enough statistical power, and then you can reweight the data to make it look representative in analyses. So fortunately, this kind of thing does get taken into account in a lot of detail in the establishment of these cohort studies, not just for ethnicity, but for multiple other different characteristics. So I think this is one of the ways that we can, if we're looking at arts and health, look not just amongst groups where we might expect them to be engaged in the arts and to be experiencing benefits, but to look at other groups, whether minority groups or people from more deprived backgrounds who might be less likely statistically to engage, and being able to see whether the same relationships are found there. So I think that it's a really exciting opportunity from these cohorts to look at those subgroups.
Great, thank you. And there's a question that I'd like to move on to. I can just move my screen. There we go. It's from Catherine Wallace. And this is looking at different types of evidence. And she asks, have you got any good examples of people using the arts to communicate research findings? How strong is the evidence that this is effective?
This is a really interesting point. We haven't really touched on this too much today. I guess things we haven't really spoken about are things like arts-based methods within research, but also the use of arts to communicate research. Fortunately, there are some really exciting things that are being done here. Examples I often look to are things within the Wellcome Trust, especially within the Wellcome Collection, where there are some phenomenal examples of the arts being used to communicate research from multiple different scientific fields. Also, there's really interesting work that's being done by the Francis Crick Institute at the moment. And of course, there are lots of other smaller organisations who are doing similar kinds of projects themselves. And I really welcome this work because it's another way that we can bring arts and science together, and it's drawing on another strength of the arts. So it really broadens when we're talking about arts and health, and not just looking at the impact of the arts, but also how the arts can help with those broader aspects of communication. And we tried to touch on this within the WHO report, as well as talking about the fundamental role of the arts within health communication, often speaking to people much better than other kinds of communication approaches.
Absolutely, and I know there's a lot of people on the call today who'll be really happy to hear you say that, Daisy. Relatedly, we have a question here about how has arts and health research been directly translated into innovation in the sector so far? We have to be careful that we don't become an echo chamber for ourselves with little outside knowledge as to how the arts can improve health and well-being.
So how has research been directly translated into innovation? Well, I guess we've got a lot of specific programs that have been developed. So we've got things like Singing for Lung Health programs, which are built on research and in order to support particular clinical outcomes. We've got things like Dance for Parkinson's programs. I mentioned Breathe Magic earlier. There are dozens of these incredibly high quality activities running that I think are really good examples of that. I think the point about the echo chamber is important, and I think sometimes we think about the arts as though an arts and health sector as though we're somehow unique from other sectors, and I think it's important to continue looking at other things like physical activity or other kinds of public health interventions, things like nutrition interventions, these other things that might not seem like they're that close to the arts on the surface, but actually are close in terms of the research methods that are being explored, the creative approaches that are being used, some of the challenges that we're facing, to make sure that we're connecting in with those other things. And I think we see it as well with things like volunteering and other kinds of community-based programs as well. So I think one thing to do is to make sure that we connect in with that. And I know sometimes we see the term culture being used rather than arts and health, so culture and health, to try and recognise that slightly broader approach. And I think that's an important thing for us to do. And I think in terms of worrying about having little to no outside knowledge, I think that comes up again about staying up to date with the evidence, making sure that what we're talking about are the latest studies and the studies that are using the latest methods or approaches, so that we're showing that we're constantly evolving in the way we're thinking about this and the way that we're doing this research. Because research is an iterative process. Every study that comes out is building on what's gone before. And over years, the methods really advance. They've advanced so quickly in the last decade alone. So I think trying to make sure that we're up to date, so that breadth and that forward thinking.
Thank you. And one of the things that you and Darren covered in some detail was work around social prescribing. There's another question here from Holly Marland. I wanted to ask how social prescribing key workers will really understand the quality and diversity of arts projects they might be referring people to. And this is certainly a question that we've had going around at the Leeds Arts Health and Wellbeing Network. So be keen to hear your thoughts, Daisy.
I'm not sure I have an answer, because this is one that I've been discussing with colleagues recently as well. I think a lot of this is going to come down to the types of training and the kinds of frameworks that are put in place for social prescribing link workers, so that to find out what they have to learn before they start jobs, what they learn on the job. And I think that a lot of that information will probably be coming out from the National Academy for Social Prescribing. But I also think it's about the relationship that link workers will build with the arts organisations and the other organisations within their communities. And I think if those relationships are really strong, there should be this sort of mutual process of learning. And we actually did a study on this that came out earlier this year, where we looked at community organisations and tried to work out why some of them were engaging with social prescribing and why some of them weren't. And it felt like there were some tangible barriers in that. So things like the contract processes for social prescribing can be very heavy weather, as well as there could be financial challenges in actually getting into that work, or concerns about not having the right skills on each side. But there were also some communication challenges that were coming across there. And we've put forward a series of recommendations in that paper, and that paper's on the March Network website, for how we think some of those barriers can be overcome in the future. And I think it's important we keep looking at where those blockages might be, because it's only if we've got that really good communication and working between arts and the link workers that will actually have really effective social prescribing programs happening. And what we definitely know is that quality matters in terms of the activities people are referred to, but also in terms of the quality of that process of referral for the patient to feel like they're actually having that smooth experience that has those psychological and physical benefits for them.
Thank you. And if it's not too much on the spot, there's a question here, related question for Darren. So Darren, if you're there, I wonder if I could ask you to put your camera back on. There's a question from somebody else regarding social prescribing. So for Darren, how will the Arts Council be helping artists to do the work of social prescribing, health research using arts-based methods and activity development that health commissioners may not actually be funding yet?
It's a really important area for us. I think it will be a growth area for us. I think that well-being and again, what artists and arts organisations can do to improve the quality of life of people up and down the country is important. So we have co-funded the setting up of the National Academy for Social Prescribing, and that will be rolling out. There is a funding call out live at the moment, so we are investing money from that in social prescribing, and I think we want to go through that process of getting that rigorous learning of what does work and then sharing that properly and making sure that we're having that two-way conversation. One of the things I always say is, you know, we as from the arts world need to really understand that the long-term funding from this will come from clinical commissioners, so there will be things that they're looking for, and we need to understand their language, their labelling, and be able to show that work we're doing is effective in the way that they would want it to be. I think there's always a danger of us over-claiming, and we mustn't do that, but when we have got rigorous data that shows that we're cheaper than a pill, we get people better quicker, we can stop people getting sick in the first place, all of those things which actually make a massive difference to people's quality of life and to their health outcomes, then we need to be very strong and robust about that. And there's lots of people working in this area. For us, as we go forward into Let's Create our new 10-year strategy, it is a very important part of what we'll do going forward.
That's great, and we're coming to the end of our time. That seems like a good point to draw it to a close.